everybody, I'm Mango Thunderslice, and today we're continuing with how the Redheads built the pyramids, part 8, and this is going to be more about the Phoenicians and how that ancient group of people relates to the British Isles and, Ireland and Scotland. So here we go. This is chapter 12 in Michael TSARION's book, The Irish Origins of Civilization, the Phoenicians. Joachim de Villeneuve wrote a book called Phoenician Ireland, which maintained that Irish Druids were the snake priests of those seafarers. The Phoenicians, or more correctly the Arya, were one of the greatest maritime races in the history of the world. Also known as the Arcadians or Bear Race, they were the world's most proficient mariners, traders, shipwrights, architects, and astronomers. There was not a civilization in ancient Europe and Asia that did not owe a debt of gratitude to the Phoenicians. This was especially the case with the Egyptians. The civilizations of pre-dynastic Egypt were established by these mysterious people of unknown origin. The first dynasty of Egypt was made up of Phoenician kings, and the languages of the two countries are strikingly similar. The language of the Phoenicians was not, as most scholars are wont to believe and advocate, a dialect of Egyptian. On the contrary, the Egyptian language was derived from Phoenician. Phoenicia led the way to a wider literacy through the development of the alphabet. The alphabet that the early Israelites used was and is demonstrably based on the Phoenician script. This new Phoenician script became the basis for the later Hebrew, Greek, and Latin scripts, and so this aspect of Phoenician culture has become a central component of all Western cultures. One of the main reasons why ancient Israel has disappeared from the stage of history is that Israel did not speak Hebrew but Phoenician. The Phoenician legends show that Misor, from whom the Egyptians were descended, was the child of the Phoenician gods Amanus and Megas. Misor gave birth to Taut, the god of letters, the inventor of the alphabet, and Taut became Thoth, the god of history of the Egyptians. Sanchoniathon tells us that Cronos, king of Atlantis, visited the south and gave all Egypt to the god Taut, so that it might be his kingdom. Misor is probably the king Mestor named by Plato. An objective study of the evidence shows that Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, and Armenian, as well as many other ancient languages, were enriched by Phoenician tropes. We have found in the most ancient records of the Aryan language proof that the indications of religious thought are higher, simpler, and purer as we go back in time. The names of the patriarchal heroes, as of that of God himself, are non-Semitic, and go back to the earliest known civilizations in the Near East, indeed, of the world. All the languages of the Western world were the same, and that one system of letters, that of the ancient Irish Druids, pervaded the whole, and was common to the British Isles and Gaul, to the inhabitants of Italy, Greece, Syria, Arabia, Persia, and Hindustan. When the 10 tribes of Israel were taken into Assyrian captivity, they took their language with them, and the only inscription that they left in Palestine is the Siloam inscription in Jerusalem, and it is not in Hebrew, but in Phoenician. The ancient Hebrews had the same tongue and letters or characters with the Canaanites or Phoenicians, as might be evidenced from the concurrent testimonies of many authors, nay, all the nations in these parts, Phoenicians, Canaanites, Samaritans, and probably the Assyrians, for some years spoke and wrote alike. A strong affinity was palpable between the Celts and the Phoenician. Their language, religion, and institutions not only appear to have been similar but identical. They not only traded with but colonized Spain, the British Islands, and Celtic Gaul. Ancient colonies of Phoenicians settled in Spain, Ireland, Britain, and Gaul long before the Christian era, and that they called themselves Gaels, or Gaeltacht, or Celtai, and that the Irish, the Gael of Scotland, and the Manx are now the only descendants of that ancient people who spoke their language. The Celtic language, according to some authorities, is a dialect of the Phoenician language, the Phoenician being a close relative of the Hebrew. There is certainly a close resemblance in many details between the Hebrew and Irish languages. The Celts simply adapted the written languages of the people they had contact with, all of whom were to a greater or lesser extent derived from Phoenician. As our scholars have failed to see the difference between Israel and the Jews, they have completely confused the issue, and when they speak of ancient Hebrew, they mean Phoenician. The oldest Hebrew manuscript dates from AD 489, is a roll and found in the Karaite synagogue in the Crimea. The Targum version of the Old Testament does not date any earlier than the Babylonian captivity of the Jews, and it was written in the Aramaic Chaldee language, and even of that version there is no BC in existence. So when our scholars speak of the ancient Hebrew of the Israelites, they mean Phoenician evidently, for they have never seen it written on a scroll, only on the Siloam inscription, the Moabite stone, and the Phoenician engravings of the East, the Mediterranean, southern Russia, and Europe, particularly in Britain. Neither the Phoenician nor the Aramaic possessed any vowels, therefore the pronunciations differed according to locality and age. The vowel signs of the Hebrew manuscripts were introduced by Jewish scholars between the 5th and 9th centuries AD. None of the manuscripts from which our Bible was translated are older than the 4th century. Very little consideration of the table must convince anyone that the system of letters of the Samaritans, the Hebrews, Greeks, and the Irish Celts must have been originally the same. The system of letters which they, Irish and British, used was the same system and derived from the same source as the two alphabets of 17 letters brought into Greece called the Cadmean and Ionian. The perversion of truth concerning Phoenician language and culture has been fully explored by Professor L.A. Waddell, one of the first men to accurately translate many seals and scripts of the ancient world, particularly those of Phoenicians, Babylonians, and Sumerians, some Aryans. His exemplary and incontestable discoveries have been deliberately suppressed by obscurantists whose elusive patrons have a great deal to lose should the facts about our world's true history be widely known. This book is also offered as a pioneer contribution towards a true universal history of man from the earliest civilized period founded on concrete facts, as opposed with current dogmatic theories appealing to tradition and prejudice, and it is often to be feared designed in the interest of those who profit by the maintenance of error. Unlike Professor Waddell, I do not believe the Phoenicians were originally an Eastern European people who carried their cultural elements westward to Britain during prolonged trading and mining missions. New evidence about pre-Diluvian civilizations in the West and concerning lost land bridges strengthens our belief in the Western origins of the Phoenician people. From the British Isles, these masters of the high seas traveled to the Americas. They carried with them their Gaelic tongue still spoken by Algonquin Indians of Canada and North America. From their homeland beyond the Pillars of Hercules, they traveled eastward, taking their cultural idioms to Oriental lands. There were few places on the face of the earth Phoenician ships had not docked. The fact is that Ireland was the first power that colonized along both sides of the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore the colonies came from the west instead of from the east, as our astute Roman and British historians would have us believe. And the world has believed it up to now. Investigators have followed the fast clue sent out from this source and found nothing in the east to support this claim that the Aryans emigrated from the east and colonized toward the west. The real and true evidence points just in the opposite direction. In my estimation, there can be little doubt that the Phoenicians originated in Britain. I wholeheartedly agree with Professor Waddell, who first declared in the 1920s that the Phoenicians were definitely related tribally and ethnically to the Sumerians, Amorites, Hittites, and perhaps the Minoans of Crete. As Ralph Ellis has shown, the Minoans of Crete were closely connected to the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. It is therefore logical to assume the Phoenicians, Minoans, and Hyksos were associated in some way, culturally, racially, or more likely economically. In any case, there can be little doubt, given the philological evidence, that Phoenicians and Sumerians were one and the same people. However, unlike Professor Waddell, I do not believe the original homeland of Phoenicians and Sumerians was Cappadocia in modern Turkey, or that it was the Danube Valley. I believe it to have been Britain. It is therefore through the travels of the Phoenicians that the world's parent language dispersed. Additionally, from the Phoenicians came the first unadulterated stellar and solar religion, first organized pantheons, as well as other techniques of science, architecture, music, and art. According to the traditions of the Phoenicians, the gardens of the Hesperides were in the remote west. With the exception of Ptolemy, who in all likelihood derived his knowledge from the trading Phoenicians, the early Greek and Latin writers knew only of Ireland that it was an island sitting in the Western Ocean and remarkable for its verdure. Yet the Phoenicians were probably well acquainted with its ports. Tacitus says the Irish ports in the 1st century were well known to commerce and merchants. The Phoenicians were unquestionably identified with Atlantis, and it was probably from Atlantis they derived their god Baal, or Bel, or El, whose name crops out in the Bel of the Babylonians, the Elohim, and the Beelzebub of the Jews, and the Allah of the Arabians, and we find that this great deity was known and adored also upon the northern and western coasts of Europe. Professor Nilsson finds traces of Baal worship in Scandinavia. He tells us that the festival of Baal, or Balder, was celebrated on Midsummer's Night in Scania and far up into Norway, almost to the Lofoten Islands, until within the last 50 years. The feast of Baal, or Beltane, was celebrated in Ireland to a late period. I argue from these facts, not that the worship of Baal came to Ireland and Norway from Assyria or Arabia, but that the same great parent race which carried the knowledge of Baal to the Mediterranean brought it also to the western coasts of Europe, and with the adoration of Baal they imported also the implements of bronze now found in such abundance in those regions. Mannanan carried a bag made from the skin of a crane that purportedly contained the alphabet, an echo of the Phoenicians. Although Mediterranean and Asian cultures went on to develop, refine, and also distort cultural elements inherited from Western elders, they were not their original manufacturers. The seeds of Eastern European and Asian civilization were transmitted not from Scythia, as most Celtic scholars concede, but from further west. The originators were greatly endowed Atlantean inhabitants of the furthest west sunset land, who fashioned by their art the colossal western temples still seen at Stonehenge, Newgrange, Carrowkeel, Avebury, and Carnac. Newgrange is the oldest scientific instrument in the world still functioning. It predates Stonehenge and the pyramids and stands as one of the world's most ancient monuments. It is quite likely it will still be functioning when our own scientific instruments have turned to dust. The first archaeological remains of a sundial were found in Egypt dating from 1200 BC, but the dials found at Noth represented an advanced stage of sundialing. Egypt is highly unusual in that the early craftsmanship and construction from the Old Kingdom are the finest, and the quality and dimensions of each monument reduce from them on throughout the following millennia. These temples were not dedicated to any one particular monarch, nor to any one particular god. They were instead dedicated to the observation and the study of the universe. The original theology and ritual of the megalithic priesthood demanded that there were no idols, no imagery, and no inscriptions, as the design of these monuments was not supposed to give away the identity of the architects or builders. Though Stonehenge may be the proudest singularity of this sort in the world, as far as we know yet, there are so many others, manifestly formed upon the same or kindred design, by the same measure and for the same purpose, all over the Britannic Isles, that we can have no room to doubt of their being made by the same people, and that by direction of the British Druids. There are innumerable from the Land's End in Cornwall to the utmost northern promontory in Scotland, where the Roman power never reached. They are to be found in all the islands between Scotland and Ireland, Isle of Man, all the Orkney Islands, etc., and numerous in Ireland itself. And there is no pretense, as far as I can see, for any other persons or nations being the founders of them. In light of this, I believe that the official dates given for the rise of the Phoenicians are inaccurate. I agree with Commons Beaumont and L.A. Waddell that their ancestry goes further back in time. What we do know is that the term Phoenician is thought to have derived from one of three main sources. The word referred to the purple dye extracted from shellfish by the Phoenicians, who held the monopoly on its production. This dye was preferred by the pharaohs and nobles of Egypt, and was primarily a color of royalty. Then we find the word connected to the mythical bird known as the phoenix, and to the sacred tree of this strange creature, namely the date palm. As I show in The Trees of Life, the image of the date palm frond that turns up in the story of Jesus was to be found above the doorways and windows of temples, shrines, and sacred colleges. Cities such as Tanis, which author Ralph Ellis believes was the actual site of the biblical Jerusalem, were richly adorned with majestic palm columns and decorative stone palm frond motifs. Amid the frond motif was usually the solar disk. This is understandable because the palm frond and the date palm tree were both sacred to the priests of Amun-Ra. I believe the cult of Amun-Ra had its origins in Ireland. The Phoenicians, therefore, had a strong connection to one of the most ancient and important priesthoods of the sun. The phoenix symbolized spiritual resurrection, as well as long astrological cycles and their computation. Like the Irish Druids and Egyptian Magi, the Phoenicians were mystical adepts. They produced great navigators, architects, and scientists, as well as great scholars, poets, and seers. Their eastern cities were incomparably impressive. Officially, the Phoenicians are known to have frequently traveled to Britain, where they mined for copper and tin. The world's oldest highway is the ocean. The Egyptians referred to the Druids as the people of the sea. The Arcadians were known as the Bear race. They were also, in their most ancient sense, the original Phoenicians. Furthermore, the stars of Ursa Minor were those principally used in all navigation by land as well as by sea to direct the course of the traveler. Thus the Arcadian or Bear race were known as the guides or pathfinders of mankind, leading and lighting the way like Mercury or Hermes. The Phoenicians were renowned sailors and navigators, as well as teachers and healers. In primitive centuries, when ancient maritime races thus held supremacy in the Mediterranean Sea, voyages were undoubtedly made far into the Atlantic Ocean. The Phoenicians, who of all the nations settled on its shores lay among the remotest from the outlying ocean, habitually traded with settlements on the Atlantic. They colonized the western shores of the Mediterranean at a remote period, occupied numerous favorable trading posts on the bays and headlands of the Euxine, as well as that of Sicily and others of larger islands, passing beyond the straits, effected settlements along the coasts of Europe and Africa. According to Strabo, they had factories beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the period immediately succeeding the Trojan War, an era which yearly becomes for us less mythical and to which may be assigned the great development of the commercial prosperity of Tyre. Solomon had good reason for assuring himself of active Phoenician support. No one disputes that the Phoenicians were masters at that time of both the Mediterranean and seas further to the east. They were the traders. No other people so boldly ventured onto the world's waters. No other people would have even dared sail around Africa. Characteristically, the Phoenicians had no land on which they settled, but rather a network of shipping facilities and numerous far-flung outposts at places across the known world. I concur with Professor Waddell's theory that the original Phoenicians were not members of the Semitic racial family, given that such an entity even exists. Archaeological evidence clearly shows they were like the Irish and Scots ethnically and racially Gothic, Nordic, Indo-European, and Caucasian, or, as Professor Waddell preferred, Aryan. I have no doubt Western tribes of later ages, such as Scythians, Ostrogoths, and Visigoths, or Vandals, were racially kindred to Phoenicians. The vast and sophisticated, but rarely mentioned, empire of the Visigoths, wise Goths, in North Africa lasted for hundreds of years, almost as long as the duration of Rome. Thus the daring Phoenician pioneer mariners, and of whose contributions to the civilization of Greece and Rome classic writers speak in glowing terms, were, I found by indisputable inscriptional and other evidence, not Semites as hitherto supposed, but were Aryans in race, speech, and script. The original Irish who survived immense cataclysm knew they needed access to the rest of the world in order to survive. They knew this meant the development of a navy. For this reason, the navigators were created. They were the Phoenicians, the expert observers of the heavens and mappers of the world. Their sidereal knowledge was an extension of the Druidic wisdom perfected over centuries in northwestern lands. Their knowledge allowed the Hyperboreans to expertly navigate the oceans of the world. Like later Vikings and Danes, the Phoenicians sailed to the east and west, creating small settlements on the coasts of lands they visited, traded, and mined. Because of their prolonged commercial dealings with Asians and Orientals, the Phoenicians' alphabet, as well as many other Phoenician customs and practices, were absorbed. Eventually, the Phoenicians themselves, at the time of Roman expansion and after their roving decreased, mixed with foreign races and eventually lost their racial distinctiveness. One of the terms used by Phoenicians to describe themselves was Barat, also Barata or Parats. This was the name of one of their earliest kings, the Sumerian Brihat. I surmise that this king, like his seafaring people, was named after the land of their ancestors, namely Barata, Brita, or Britain. From their name we also derive the Indo-Aryan tribe known as the Barats, who frequented the Indus Valley. I do not think Britain received its name from the Phoenicians after they traveled there from the east. One of the most important Phoenician goddesses was known as Brit Anna, meaning Lady of the Waters. She is clearly depicted on Carthaginian Phoenician coins, often holding a ship's rudder or sitting near the ocean. An early Phoenician and Sumerian sun god was known as Dar or Der, a name similar to Jer, the third king of Egypt's first dynasty. Dar was the prototype for the Nordic gods Thor and Balder, and for heroic semi-mythical British King Arthur. The term Dar is, however, close to the root for druid. The syllable turns up in the name of the Persian king Darius and can certainly be ascribed to the oak trees sacred to the Druids. The Irish druidical rites manifested themselves principally in sun worship. Their chief god was Bel or Baal, the same worshipped by the Phoenicians, the god of the sun. Strabo says that in an isle near to Britain, the worship of Ceres and Persephone was celebrated with the same rites as in Samothrace. Interestingly, the word Bible refers to the great Phoenician city of Byblos in Lebanon. Byblos was the capital of learning to which adepts flocked. In the schools and colleges of Byblos, they pursued their studies of the arts and sciences. Byblos was known in Arabic as Gubail, Gibal, or Jubel. Note the Gaelic Baal or Bel roots connoting the Druidic god. This suggests that another name for the Phoenicians in the east was Gibbers or even Hibbers. This may have been the origin of Hebrew as appropriated and used by later mythmongers, attributed to people who did not deserve the title. In any case, along with the Phoenician city Sidon, Byblos is considered the oldest city in the world, certainly the oldest in the East. Through the city's waterways passed ships carrying papyrus to make books. Indeed, the word book comes from buka, the Egyptian word for the papyrus plant. Tradition has it that the city was founded by Thoth, god of writing and sacred knowledge. Cronus, from the Irish crom, was a tutelary deity of the city. The incredible antiquity and sophistication of Byblos was confirmed when Egyptian artifacts were discovered dating from before the 4th Pharaonic dynasty, over 2,500 years BC. After the Romans invaded and vastly changed the appearance of Byblos, they suggestively made the city a center for the worship of their god Adonis, a version of Irish and Phoenician god Donar, or Odin. It has been conceded by anthropologists and linguists that the alphabet was invented by the mysterious Phoenicians. A complete alphabet of 22 letters was discovered at Byblos, dating back to at least 1200 BC. Phoenicians were inventors of the so-called Cadmean letters, which subsequently became the basis for Greek and Latin. What has not been officially conceded is the Irish origins of the Phoenicians. Although their great settlements and cities, Carthage, Tyre, Byblos, Sidon, Pelusium, and Arvad, were situated in the Middle East, they are not to be considered the ancestral homes of the Phoenicians. When we read in our popular histories of Phoenicia, we must never consider it as a national unity like Egypt, Babylon, or Rome, for Phoenicia in this respect was different from any other country in history. Phoenicia never at any time was a nation under one government, but was merely a geographical designation. Official historians have not properly placed the Phoenician race. They refuse to decide on their true ancestry and geographical homeland. We know this to be for a good reason. To do so would inevitably not only shatter the myth of world history as accepted by the masses, but confirm theories concerning the Irish origins of civilization. Only alternative historians Ignatius Donnelly and Commons Beaumont accepted the truth of the matter and accurately placed the homeland of the Phoenicians in Ireland and Scotland. According to Beaumont, the Phoenician base of operation may have been ancient Moravia. The word Moravia contains the root mor, which like mer denotes the ocean. It is a root that turns up in Fomorian, Amorite, and Merovingian. In Egyptian, the syllable mer signified the pyramid and the keepers of arcane secrets. Geographically, Moravia was an area stretching from Caithness in the extreme northwest of Scotland, southward along the River Tay to Inverness, and even further south to Perth. The Phoenicians were not unrelated to the ancient Caledonii, from whom Highland Picts were descended. The Picts had mythologies and histories concerning massive global cataclysm and the ruination of their original paradisiacal homelands in the north. Their lore speaks of the wars of the gods, violence in the heavens that wrecked the planet, and the subsequent dispersion of the races. The Romans saw to it that the Picts were routed and marginalized. They have been largely ignored and conveniently labeled primitive and barbaric. Commons Beaumont specifically draws our attention to the extremely interesting and suggestive fact that the first Christian churches were established in the Highlands of Scotland, specifically at Iona and Mull. The suppression of local lore and religion by the monks of early churches is a matter of historical record. I find it suggestive that the name of the first Christian saint to arrive and establish a monastic center on Iona was Columba. This name translates as dove. The island of Iona had been sacred to the Scots-Irish Arya for millennia, and it hosted druidic colleges of the greatest antiquity. The syllable Io connotes Horus, who was known by the term. In Gaelic, Iona is known as Innis Druinach, or Island of the Druids. Moreover, the name is not a million miles away from On, the name of the great Egyptian city of the sun, Heliopolis. It is believed that the 9th or 8th century BC saw the creation of the Homeric epics. Whence did the Greeks obtain all of this material of myths and legends, from which Homer and the great Attic dramatists transformed into immortal works of art? There were two important reasons why the truth about the Phoenicians had to be suppressed and occluded. The first had to do with the fact that they were of Scots-Irish extraction, and that the second was due to the fact that the Egyptians declared themselves to have inherited their civilization from them. Under no circumstances was this knowledge to become widely known. So the disinformation began to flow concerning this special and enlightened race. Almost everything we read about them is designed to deceive. It is surely no accidental circumstance that the traditional Hebrew missions follow exactly the same course as that of Phoenician colonization, and that the traditional sites of these missions are found first at the Syro-Phoenician towns along the coast border as far as Antioch, and secondly, at all the main Phoenician or Phoenician and Hebrew settlements, in Cyprus, in Sicily, in Crete, at Cyrene, in Sardinia, and Spain. The names of the ancient people and rivers of Spain, undoubtedly conferred by the Phoenicians, when collated with the Gaelic, exhibit equally satisfactory evidence of the identity of that language with the Phoenician, without an exception. It appears to be the land of Cam or Ham, the oldest traditional name for Egypt, and a usual name for that land and its people in the Hebrew Old Testament, where the Phoenicians are called sons of Ham. In Scripture, Phoenicia was closely related to Edom, both meaning red man, and they had, moreover, kings before Israel and were among the most highly civilized of the early races in the most distant prehistoric times. Another feature to be observed of the giants is that nearly always they are described as red-haired, as were the Adamites and the Edomites, names derived from the Hebrew Adam or Edom, red or ruddy. The same applies to the Phoenicians of like stock, whose name is but a derivative of the word meaning red or carroty, relating to a ruddy-faced people. Many personalities are alluded to in the biblical text by their predominant redness. King David was, for absolutely no apparent reason, said to be red. And he sent and brought David in. Now he was ruddy, red, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look at. Many of the Greek gods and heroes were admitted to be Phoenician, including Heracles, Dionysus, Cadmus, Semele, the Cabiri, Oedipus, Phoenix, and many others. From Phoenix were descended the Greek heroes Minos, Sarpedon, Rhadamanthus, Phineus, Adonis, and his daughter Europa. Phoenicia is a very important part of many of the earliest Greek myths, along with much of the Greek language. One may begin with the poems of Homer, Hesiod, and Euripides. Wherever such Phoenicians are described by the Greek writers, they were absolutely a white, fair-haired, fair-skinned people. Even the Roman poet Virgil in his Aeneid described the Carthaginian queen Dido, a Phoenician, as being blonde and beautiful. While such may not have represented the norm, it certainly was the ideal expressed consistently throughout the poets. Dr. Clark has given a coin which he says is evidently Phoenician. On one side is an inscription in the Phoenician language, but in Etruscan characters, which proves that the Phoenicians and Etruscans were the same people. The main reason why the Phoenicians have been thought of as Easterners has to do with one of the terms denoting them. This term is Kabiri or Kabiri. Duplicitous scholars and propagandists would have it known that the word means Easterner in Hebrew. However, I think it is more likely that the term simply meant those Phoenicians living in the East and not Phoenicians of the East. There is all the difference in the world between the two implications, and we are convinced from the evidence and omissions that the former is the true reading. The term Kabiri turns up in Strabo, who said that this was the name for the Phoenician elite, the masters of healing, building, navigation, and mining. The Kab-Ari were great diviners and soothsayers. Greek historian Herodotus called them the Curites, from which we get the French cure, priest, and the English cure, to heal. We find the syllable cure in Mercury, the god beloved of the Phoenicians. Mercury, whose name comes from the Egyptian Ma-Keru, meaning true words, was a most versatile god. He was the only one who could pass into either Olympus or Hades. Mercury holds the serpentine caduceus, signifying occult knowledge and mastery. We believe this symbol to be the standard not just of modern medics, but of the Irish Phoenician Kabiri, the stargazing wordsmiths of old. The term appears again around Ptah, ancient god of metallurgy. Ptah was a creator god primarily worshipped at Memphis. In the Bible, this great and ancient city was called Noph, which probably derives from Neph, meaning serpent. The word Ptah means father, and we derive the diminutive Pa from it. Ptah's Kabirore were his team of helpers assisting in the fashioning of creation. Mercury was, however, based on much older Irish gods. Commerce, much developed among the settled Gauls, gave rise to a god or gods who guarded the roads over which merchants traveled, and boundaries where their transactions took place. Hence we have an inscription from Yorkshire to the god who invented roads and paths, while another local god of roads, equated with Mercury, was Simacinus. The Irish traveled to every known country in ancient times. They bore the name Fenian or Phoenician, from Fini or Feni. This name was later rendered Phoenician. The word may be connected to Venus, which is found as a root in words and place names such as veneration, Venice, and Vienna. The ancient navigators used the planet Venus when traveling, and the prows of their ships were often styled in the form of a protecting goddess. Ships were referred to as she and considered sacred to the goddess. The consensus of most official Irish historians is that Phoenician comes from the Fenian cycle of Irish history, after the tribe of the giant king Finn MacCool. That Finn was a giant is revealing. It refers to the pre-Diluvian giants or wise ones from lost civilizations of prehistory. It also connoted the builders of great earthworks and astronomically aligned monuments. Finn is especially connected with the geological marvel known as the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland. He was a descendant of the Tuatha De Danann, the megalithic magi of Ireland who ruled millennia earlier and became the fairy or luminous ones. As the Irish legends of the sons of Turin and Bran reveal, the Irish Phoenicians were master navigators and sailors. The capital of the kings of Ireland was at Tara. In African languages, this term means tree, while in Hebrew and Egyptian it means gateway or portal. Interestingly, the name Babylon also means the same. The capital of Cappadocian Hittites, White Syrians, was Patira, and the Lebanese capital of the Phoenicians was Tyre. Indeed, the Phoenicians were also known as Tyrians. These names come from the same root denoting place of the Aryans. They were capitals of the original lawgivers and lawmakers, the original adjudicators, judges, and prophets, from Britain, not Israel. The mighty philosophers of Greece and Rome made no mention of the wisdom of Judea. It is not from eastern lands that Athenian masters took instruction. On the contrary, the erudition of Hellenes and Romans was an inheritance from the West. As the pages of ancient history reveal, the mighty Thales, the so-called father of science, was a Phoenician. Zeno Apatheia, father of Stoicism, one of the purest, most elevated philosophies, was born to Phoenician parents. The sublime Virgil, great poet of Rome, was also of Irish extraction. He lived in the Celtic city of Cisalpine Gaul. Greatest of all, Dante, father of the Renaissance, although probably not himself of Irish stock, little is known of his ancestry, was from his youth a devout acolyte of the Provençal poets and troubadours, the Provençal being a Celtic bastion in Languedoc, France. Sadly, however, there are probably more lies written about the Phoenicians than any other people, with the exception of the Irish. In fact, the Phoenicians were Scots-Irish, known for their expertise in navigation, trading, and building great structures, such as those at Baalbek. They were virtually the royal astronomers of the world, and had visited probably every corner of the globe in their fine vessels. One of the main reasons why we find so many similar cultural idioms the world over has to do with visitations by the Phoenicians. According to the scriptures, when King Solomon desired to build the great temple of Jerusalem, he called on Hiram Abiff, a Phoenician master architect, to do the job. Because the Phoenicians had already given Egypt the skills to build the pyramids, Solomon's temple proved to be no problem. Solomon knew who to call upon, and it was not the Jews. The temple, that author Ralph Ellis believes was actually located in the city of Tanis on the western side of the delta, was designed with sacred geometry and was a representation of man, not God. It was based on the proportions of the human temple. The architectural marvels found in the Lebanon, at Galicia, or Tigera, Patara, Carthage, and Petra, etc., are most likely the result of Phoenician ingenuity. That the Phoenicians were of Irish extraction is strongly suggested by the name of their second most important city, Tyre. The Phoenicians were also known as Tyrians. As said, this word comes from the same root as Tara. Interestingly, at the site of Newgrange, Gaelic Brúd na Bóin, a carving of a Phoenician ship has been found. Its presence within this most famous and architecturally superlative site puzzled archaeologists and researchers for generations. It is now known that pyramidal structures existed at the Newgrange site. These buildings were deliberately removed. The answer that solves the problem is the one few dare accept. The carving of the Phoenician vessel found within Newgrange, one of the most astonishing and magnificent megaliths in the world, was put there not by some untraceable visitors who just happened to be passing through, but by the builders of the Great Cairn, the selfsame Phoenicians, Fenians, or Phoenicians. Mystery solved. In Smith's Dictionary of the Bible, the religion of the Phoenicians is described in a way Morion has done that of the Druids, a personification of the forces of nature, which, in its more philosophical shadowing forth of the supreme powers, may be said to have represented the male and female principles of production. Although Palestine continued throughout the Bronze Age as an illiterate backwater, this was not true of Phoenicia. Its towns resembled the great cities of Syria. A literate artistic culture of considerable merit developed at Ugarit in the 14th and 13th centuries, and scribes communicated regularly between the major towns of Palestine, from Bithos, Shechem, and Jerusalem and the Egyptian court. Writing had long been established in Syria at the market town of Ebla from as early as the 24th century BC, and a few examples of literary texts have been found from Alak and Megiddo. These revelations forced duplicitous historians such as Piazzi Smith and Frederick Haberman to re-examine the role of the Phoenicians and begrudgingly accept it, as it was they and not the Israelites who were the creators of the alphabet, the great temple builders, and the world's finest seafarers, astronomers, and adepts. What they refused to accept is the Scots-Irish origins of the Phoenicians. This fact has been obscured due to the geographical dispersion of the Phoenicians. As said, this dispersion was a necessity after the Age of Catastrophe. Unfortunately, by spreading themselves thinly across the world and by assimilating with nations that far outnumbered them, the Phoenicians and their kindred groups eventually disappear as distinct entities. Here's an image of a Phoenician man. Note his Caucasian features. The damage to the nose was probably deliberately committed to make his aquiline features less obvious. Desecration of this kind is common in Egypt and Asia Minor. For example, faces of figures beside the throne of Aryan King Darius were completely hacked away to disguise their Western identity. The Bible refers to the Phoenicians as remnants of the giants. See Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11. Phoenician artifacts have been discovered identical in design to those made by the ancient Irish. Here's a photo of two Phoenician youths from the city of Sidon, a bust of a Phoenician woman, and here's a statue of Adon. Adonis, or Don, was tutelary deity of Byblos, seat of the Phoenicians. The word Bible comes from Byblos. Adon's prototypes are found in the West as Odin, Donar, and Balder. In Greek legend, the soul of Adonis was claimed by Persephone, goddess of the underworld. Adon was clearly a prototype for Adonai, or Jehovah, that is, for Aton, Lord of Light. The word Adon meant Lord. His worshippers, the Sidonians, Tyrians, Arcadians, or as we know them, the Phoenicians, constructed the Temple of Solomon for the Israelites. But was the temple dedicated to Jehovah or Adon? Or were these gods one and the same? Is the Egyptian Aton identical with the Aryan Adon? We are bound to think so. Here's an image of Phoenician ships with horse-headed prows. The horse was a seminal goddess symbol and often used in place of a dragon or serpent. Another image. Jewish historians freely admit that their King Solomon commissioned Phoenician architect Hiram Abiff to design and construct his great temple. The design was based on the Sanctum Sanctorum, or Holy of Holies, namely the human body. The name Hiram Abiff means Holy Father or Highborn. Despite this concession, Christian mythmongers royally demonized Phoenicians and Canaanites, accusing them of child sacrifice and orgiastic rites. Alright, and that is the end of Chapter 12 of Michael TSARION's book, The Irish Origins of Civilization. More about the Phoenicians. Hope you guys found that interesting. You know, we're told a lot about Phoenicians in history class, and a lot of it is, left mysterious, right? We don't know about the Phoenicians, but again, like I closed the last one, they know about the Phoenicians. They're just hiding the history of the human race. Remember that it was Rome that burned the temple and library of Alexandria, and then 10 centuries later is promoting all this knowledge and learning, but only within the structure that they had set up. Once they had eliminated all of the history that they found undesirable, right, then they could encourage us all to learn about the world, once they had eliminated all the evidence that they didn't want around. So that's the video. We'll be continuing with this in the future. Hope you guys are having a great day, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.